Hello everybody, today I thought I would do something a little bit different and take a look at an amazing Spider-Man figure from Mafex or Mafex. For those who aren't aware, Mafex is a company that specialises in 6-inch, high-end, highly articulated action figures. They've acquired quite a broad range of licenses to very popular properties across the years, including Star Wars and of course Marvel and even some of the DC films. These figures are imports, and so they tend to come with quite a hefty price tag. Sometimes you can find them on the aftermarket for a fairly reasonable price, but in the main, the usual sort of price tag is around about £100 in the UK. And I think it's fair to say that in recent years they've made quite a splash in the collector community because they have been producing these very highly detailed, highly articulated action figures, and they've helped evolve and shape the market going forwards. But whilst these figures are undoubtedly revolutionary and they offer an awful lot, with that price tag it can be very difficult to decide whether you want to go ahead and purchase one, especially if you have that completist burn in your body which makes you want to buy everything. It gets very pricey very quickly. So for myself, I don't have an unlimited budget sadly, so I do have to pick and choose which characters I'm going to pick up. So I tend to wait for the ones that I'm really super fond of and pick them up. So today I'm going to take a look at Spider-Man to see what he's got in store for me. So starting with the packaging is usually fairly disappointing. It's usually quite flimsy. The cardboard is quite thin, it usually warps quite easily, and there's not a lot of support to it. That said, in this case, I think they've done a very nice job of the overall presentation though, because it's very colourful. I love that, obviously, of course, we have the window display so we can see the figure and all those bits and pieces, which is really fun. But I really like in the left-hand corner how we have that sort of Marvel ident that we were used to seeing on all the comic books. And we obviously have an image of Spidey hanging upside down there. I think that is really very cool. It's a really lovely little touch and definitely captures the spirit of the comic books, which is really great. I also like how they've continually used his colours throughout the theme of the packaging, so we have a lot of the red and the blues. I think this is very nice, and we have a nice image of the figure in a really fantastic action pose there at the very bottom as well. And in terms of the window display, it's quite cool because on the reverse, sadly you can't pull this inlay out, but it is a cartoon sort of cityscape in the background, which is kind of cool. Nice purple sky as well to really enhance the figure, make it pop a bit more in the packaging. So that's a really nice touch, I think, overall. And you can see in the background there is actually an illustrated image in that sort of greyed out as well. And these images, I think these are illustrations from, I think, Mark Bagley and Eric Larson. So this is definitely obviously harking back to the 90s Spider-Man. Meanwhile, this theme is carried on to the side panel, so again we have the blue and the red, which is very striking. We have an illustrated image in the background that's sort of greyed out there, which is really cool. And of course we have a central image again of the figure in a really dynamic action pose, which is fantastic. But I also really like how they've used the two different Spider-Man head icons as well that we've seen across the years in the Marvel comics. So I think this is a really nice touch, makes it very displayable, and you can put this on the shelf quite nicely with other characters as well. And then on the reverse of the packaging, we have lots of different action shots. There's a full breakdown of all the bits and pieces that he comes with as well, which is pretty cool. And once again, greyed out in the background, there's another classic 90s Spider-Man image. Now, I think this might actually be a Todd McFarlane image. It's kind of difficult to tell, but I'm pretty sure it is. And if so, then this is really firmly placing this Spider-Man as being the early 90s Spider-Man, which is fantastic for me. It's my favourite version of the character since, obviously, that's the one I grew up reading. And I'm pleased to say the first thing I noticed as soon as I got him out of the packaging is just how faithful he looks to the Spider-Man that I recognise from these comic books. There's definitely something they've caught in the detailing and the shape of his body that looks really, well, spot on like Spider-Man really. I don't know how else to say it. Like, it's just exactly right for a Mark Bagley drawn Spider-Man, or even potentially a Todd McFarlane Spider-Man. Now, I think this is probably most telling in the head sculpt, especially if we look at the head that comes with the figure as standard in the packaging. We can see those big eyes are clearly a 90s inspired Spider-Man, where they started to play with this a lot more. I think it was Todd McFarlane who really enlarged the eyes, and that definitely seems to be what they've gone for here. And I think they've more or less in the comics more or less kept that across the years anyway, but this to me is very distinctive of being part of that era, and I think they've done a really nice job of the head sculpt. And as I said, that runs through the entire figure really. The dimensions, the proportions all look pretty much spot on. Now, one of the criticisms I might have of the Mafex is that they give him so much articulation that there's an awful lot of joints and pieces and overlap of these pieces, so it can look a little bit messy. If you're not someone who likes to see a lot of seams and a lot of joints and prefers more of the Marvel Select approach, where they're much more statuesque rather than having lots of articulation, then this probably isn't for you. Because as you can see, there is an awful lot of pieces to this figure to make sure that he's got all that enhanced articulation, which works really, really well. So these figures tend to be aimed more at people who really like being able to have lots of display options for their figures and do lots of interesting poses and dynamic positions for them. Now, a quick word on the paint apps and the colouring. I think, once again, they've done a very nice job. One thing that I think is really impressive about the figure is the blue that runs throughout it, because, and to be fair, even the red as well, because there's lots of little shading going on with this. In the red, we see a little bit of black running through it, just to give it that bit more of definition, a bit more visual interest, which I think works a treat. And on the blue, likewise, there seems to be two shades running through this. Now, it's not a metallic blue, but it definitely catches the light in a very nice way. And it has this slightly shimmery, slightly metallic look to it at times, so I think this works really, really well. It looks very, very nice, so I'm really pleased with the colouring on this. It's not the brightest Spider-Man. On the contrary, his costume seems to be a bit more muted, a bit darker, but it kind of works really, really well, and like I said, it sums up my interpretation of what I was reading when I was a kid, so this works perfectly well for me. The only minor criticism I might have is the spider emblem at the top of his chest. Just looks a little bit too scrunched up together there, just looks a little bit too narrow, too squished. I think it probably should be a little bit wider, not hugely, but maybe just the legs just spaced out a little bit more. Obviously, it's all open to artistic license and creative choices, but yeah, it doesn't look quite right, I think. And on the reverse, of course, we have the other spider emblem, which is a nice big red spider. I think this looks pretty good. I think this is fairly faithful. Again, there's different interpretations of it in the comic books, but this seems to be roughly in the right dimensions and looks pretty solid. I'm pleased to say that he has no issue standing whatsoever. In fact, you can put him in a variety of different poses, and the mould of these feet are perfectly balanced, so that will accommodate most poses, so there's no danger of him falling over. So I've already spoken a lot about the articulation, so let's have a closer look at it and see how it works. So he's got a ball joint in his neck, and he's also got a ball joint in the head as well. So both his head and neck can rotate, they can look up and down, and as you can see, there's an absolutely huge range of motion here to allow him to get him in all sorts of spidery poses, which is fantastic. So no problems here whatsoever. Now in the shoulder, there's actually a number of different joints. There's a butterfly joint in the actual upper shoulder here, which allows the arm to bend right the way back and up and down, which is really cool. And then, of course, there is also the ball jointed shoulder piece itself, which again has a huge range of motion. It can look unsightly if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, but it does allow for amazing flexibility. And as you can see, you can lift his arm right the way up if you want him to, get it right the way back if you need him to, which is fantastic. This is all complemented with a bicep swivel as well, a double jointed elbow, which is really fantastic because you can get his hand right the way to the back of his head if you want, which is brilliant. And then he's got this fantastic ball joint on his wrist as well. Now again, it can look a little bit unseemly. As you can see, there's a huge gap between his forearm and his hand, but again, if you're willing to overlook it, the amount of posing opportunities are fantastic because these are very responsive joints. You can do an awful lot with them, which is brilliant. Now he's also got a ball joint in the chest, so he can look up and down, move side to side, hinge from left to right, which is brilliant. And he's also got a similar ball joint in the waist as well. So again, huge range of motion. He can move right the way around, look up and down, move side to side, rotate, whatever you want to do with him, this figure can pretty much accommodate. The same is true of the hips. As you can see, there's a ball joint in there that allows the upper legs to rotate right the way around, kick out to the side, kick forwards and backwards. And then they're supported by another double joint in the knee as well, so the legs can kick right the way back there, which is fantastic. And once again, there's another ball joint in the ankle, so just like the wrist, the foot can arc from side to side, it can hinge forwards and backwards, and there's also extra articulation in the toes as well. So all bases have been covered here. And thanks to this articulation scheme, the possibilities are pretty much endless for the amount of dynamic poses you can put him in, all the different things you want to do, you can do with this figure. Maybe you've been limited with other Spider-Man figures in the past, but there finally feels like there are no limitations with this one. Now, that's all well and good. However, I do have to point out there is a caveat to this. As I mentioned, each of the pieces are made up of many smaller pieces that connect together, particularly when it comes to any of the ball joints. They all sort of just snap into place and clip in, and very often they very easily pop out. So don't be surprised when you're posing him, or maybe you're swapping out some of the accessories, some of the extra hands or heads or whatever it might be, that pieces start to pop off. The first Mafex figure I had where this happened, I thought it was broken. I was like, what the hell? As soon as I got out of the packaging, but it is how they're made, so they just clip back into place nice and easily. This is reassuring on the one hand because it feels like you can really take them apart, put them back together, and you don't have to worry about them snapping. So on the one hand, I commend this. On the other hand, they are a little bit too quick to pop out. So when you are posing them, it can be immensely frustrating. You get them in position and suddenly it's popped out. That is very frustrating, especially if you then have to clip back in and then something else pops out at the same time. This definitely has discouraged me from spending too much time, because you do need to persevere if you're going to do something really dynamic. If you're going to swap out some of the hands or the heads or whatever you're going to do, you're going to have to dedicate a little bit of time to this, because different things are going to pop out as you're doing it, and it can be very, very frustrating. I certainly had some issues when I've been doing it, and I don't have the patience or the time to experiment too much, I'm afraid. So yeah, just a word of warning: if you get frustrated by things like that, then these can be an immense annoyance. Now then, onto the accessories, and I'm pleased to say that Mafex are very, very generous with the amount of accessories they're giving our Spider-Man. So he comes with an extra masked head, a Peter Parker unmasked head, an empty mask, one that he can hold in his hands, then an additional 4 pairs of hands, closed, open, fists, the whole range. And then an additional pair of hands and feet with magnets in so that he can stick to metallic surfaces. And then finally, he also comes with a variety of different webs, some long, some short, some that he can wrap around his wrist so it looks like he's firing webs directly from his web shooters, a whole range here. And so here's the two masked heads together so you can see how they compare. As you can see, it is the same mold. The only difference here really is the eyes. The eyes are a lot smaller on the alternate head. This, I suppose, is to create different emotions, or even if you're just not as keen on the big bug eyes that the in-package head comes with. Here's a slightly better look at the Peter Parker unmasked head. Nice that they got the detailing right on the neck, so the webs only go halfway up his neck there, the rest is painted in, which is cool. Now, as for the sculpt itself, I think the sculpt is okay. I'm not too sure about those 2 strands coming down on his forehead. They look a little bit too separate from the main body of his hair. For me, I don't know, I think it works. It's not my favourite sculpt of Peter Parker, to be honest. It looks a little bit too soft, a little bit too watery for my liking. As for the webs, I kind of have mixed feelings, really. I'm not entirely sure what you're supposed to do with this one, for example. There is a hole at the base of this web. I don't know where this is supposed to click into, where it's meant to plug into a peg on a base, perhaps. Maybe another figure. I'm not entirely sure what you're supposed to do with this, or how Spidey's supposed to hold it. However, one of the webs that I think does work quite well is this much smaller sort of shooting out web, which is really cool. And you notice on the end it's got this hoop, and that's because you can take the hand off, slide this onto the wrist, and then put the hand back on, and it creates the effect that it is shooting out from his hands. And I think this is mostly successful. I think this creates a nice effect. I really like this as an idea. I think it looks pretty good. There's definitely a couple of issues though. Obviously you can see the web going around his wrist, which looks a little bit clunky, and also there isn't an obvious place for it to kind of rest on his hand there, on his wrist, so it can slip away. It's not fixed in position, and to be honest, I think it would have been kind of cool if they just created a web hand with a hole in it where you could have just shoved a web in there. I think that probably would have been tighter and more effective, but nevertheless I do really like this idea. And as for the magnets, I have to say I was actually very skeptical. I didn't think these would work at all, and I must admit I did have a few issues getting them in position, absolutely. And one of the magnets on the foot kept coming out, so it was kind of loose, so I kept having to force it back in. But that aside, I have to say this actually works surprisingly well. Now again, it does take a little bit of patience and a bit of perseverance, but here is the figure on my fridge. He's completely freestanding. He's got no other support apart from the magnets, and they work really well. He's held in place pretty much perfectly. He hasn't slipped, he didn't move, and it's surprisingly effective. I have to say, I actually really like this, and I think this for me is probably the huge selling point of the figure. Again, there is that caveat that you do have to spend a lot of time, because obviously things are going to snap off as you're posing him, and you do have to be creative in how you're posing him to make sure that the magnets get in position, and maybe not quite the angles you want him in, but it can be done if you persevere, and it does look really good. And I'm also pleased to say that actually you don't need all of the magnets to be connected for him to stay in place. I managed to do this with just say half of them, or even 3/4 of them. Definitely held them in place there, so you don't need all of them in order for them to stay, which is good. And then finally, as a point of contrast, I'm a huge collector of the Marvel Legends line, so I've got many different Spider-Men across the years from that line. So I thought it'd be interesting to put the two next to each other and compare them. As you can see, there are huge differences. So this Marvel Legends Spider-Man is one I've always been very happy with, but when put next to the Mafex one, it obviously pales in comparison. Now, of course, there is a huge difference in price tag, so that accounts for some of this. But I really like the colouring on this Mafex Spider-Man. I really like the body shape. Somehow, despite having a lot more articulation, it feels a lot more faithful to the source, to what we see in the comic books. The Hasbro version of Spider-Man seems to be a little bit taller, actually, which I wasn't expecting. But otherwise, yeah, there's quite a big difference between the two. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.